The autumn sun was setting over Pine Ridge neighborhood as young Michael Taylor made his way home from the local library, his backpack heavy with books about space and science. The 13-year-old boy had stayed late working on his science project, something he did quite often. His mom always said he had a curious mind, just like his father. The streets were quiet that evening, with only the occasional car passing by and the sound of leaves rustling in the gentle breeze. Michael walked confidently, taking his usual shortcut through the well-maintained suburban streets. He was thinking about dinner. His mom had promised to make his favorite lasagna, and the thought made his stomach rumble. As he turned onto Maple Avenue, he noticed Mr. Patterson standing in his driveway. The middle-aged man was known throughout the neighborhood, but not for good reasons. He owned the biggest real estate company in town and lived in one of the most expensive houses on the street, but people often whispered about his temper. He was a large man, not particularly tall but heavy-set, with a face that seemed permanently set in a frown. Michael didn't think much of it as he walked along the sidewalk. He'd passed this way hundreds of times before, and while Mr. Patterson wasn't exactly friendly, he'd never caused any trouble. Today was different, though. Whether it was the stress from a bad day at work or something else entirely, something in Mr. Patterson snapped when he saw Michael walking near the edge of his perfectly manicured lawn. "Hey, what do you think you're doing?" Mr. Patterson's voice boomed across the yard, making Michael jump. The boy stopped, confused. He was clearly on the sidewalk, nowhere near the man's precious grass. "I'm just walking home, sir," Michael replied politely, just as his parents had taught him. He held his backpack straps tightly, suddenly feeling uncomfortable under Mr. Patterson's hostile glare. The man stormed toward him, his face turning an alarming shade of red. "You kids are always cutting through my property. I'm sick of it," he shouted, even though Michael hadn't stepped foot on his lawn. Mrs. Chen, who lived across the street, was watering her flowers and looked up at the commotion. A few doors down, Mr. Rodriguez paused while unloading groceries from his car. They could all see that Michael was innocent of any wrongdoing, but something about Mr. Patterson's aggressive stance made them hesitate to step in. Just then, a young woman jogging by slowed down, pulling out her phone. She wasn't from the neighborhood, but she knew something wasn't right about what she was seeing. As she started recording, Mr. Patterson's behavior only got worse. The situation escalated in seconds. Mr. Patterson reached out and grabbed Michael's backpack, causing the boy to stumble. Books spilled onto the sidewalk, including Michael's precious library copy of The Universe and Beyond that he'd been so careful with. The man started yelling things that no child should ever have to hear, words filled with hate and prejudice that had nothing to do with lawn care or property lines. Michael, despite his fear, showed remarkable composure for a young teen. He didn't cry or yell back. Instead, he focused on keeping his balance and trying to break free from the man's grip. His heart was pounding, but in his mind, he could hear his father's voice from one of their many talks. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away. Little did Mr. Patterson know that his actions that evening would set off a chain of events that would change not just his life, but the entire community's perspective. Because Michael wasn't just any kid from the neighborhood. His father's position in the justice system would ensure that this incident wouldn't be swept under the rug like so many others before it. The next few minutes felt like hours as Mr. Patterson's grip tightened on Michael's backpack. The young jogger who had stopped to record wasn't the only one watching anymore. Several neighbors had come out onto their porches, drawn by the commotion. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. "You people always think you can do whatever you want." Mr. Patterson continued shouting, his face getting redder by the second. His words were slurred with anger, spittle flying from his mouth as he towered over Michael. The man's expensive suit was wrinkled, and his normally well-kept hair was disheveled, making him look almost unhinged. Mrs. Chen had put down her watering can and taken a few steps forward, her phone already in her hand. "Leave the boy alone, Richard," she called out, her voice shaking but determined. He's done nothing wrong. Mr. Rodriguez had abandoned his groceries and was quickly walking toward the scene, his car door still open. Michael, despite his heart racing, remembered everything his parents had taught him about staying calm in difficult situations. He didn't struggle wildly or yell back. That would only make things worse. Instead, he spoke clearly, his voice steady even though his hands were trembling. "Sir, please let go of my backpack. I'm just trying to get home." The young jogger, still recording, had moved closer. "Hey," she called out, wanting to make her presence known. "Everything's being recorded here." She was wearing bright running clothes and had her hair pulled back in a ponytail, looking completely ordinary except for the fierce determination in her eyes. That's when Mr. Patterson made his biggest mistake. Maybe it was the mention of being recorded, or maybe he'd simply lost all control, but he shoved Michael hard. The boy stumbled backward, trying to keep his balance. His glasses fell off, clattering onto the sidewalk. The crowd gasped. Mr. Rodriguez broke into a run. Mrs. Chen shouted something in Mandarin and started dialing 911. The jogger stepped closer, making sure to capture everything clearly on her phone. Michael managed to stay on his feet, but something had changed in his eyes. The fear was still there, but now there was something else too. A quiet dignity that seemed beyond his years. He looked directly at Mr. Patterson, not with anger, but with a kind of sad understanding that made the man falter for just a moment. "My father," Michael said quietly, "always tells me that true strength isn't about how much power you have, but how you use it." Those words seemed to hang in the air. Even Mr. Patterson paused, perhaps sensing for the first time that he had made a terrible mistake. The jogger's phone captured it all. The moment of silence, the slight change in Mr. Patterson's expression as doubt finally began to creep in. That's when they heard the police sirens in the distance. Someone had called them, probably one of the neighbors who'd been watching from their windows. Mr. Patterson's grip on Michael's backpack loosened, and the boy took the opportunity to step away quickly, picking up his glasses from the ground. Mr. Rodriguez had reached them by now, positioning himself between Michael and Mr. Patterson. The jogger stopped recording and walked over to Michael, asking if he was okay. Mrs. Chen was talking rapidly on her phone, giving their location to the 911 operator. As the police sirens grew louder, Mr. Patterson seemed to deflate, like a balloon losing its air. The rage that had possessed him moments ago was replaced by something that looked almost like fear. Perhaps he was finally realizing that his actions would have consequences. Consequences that would reach far beyond this quiet suburban street. But Michael wasn't thinking about consequences yet. All he wanted was to get home to his mom's lasagna, to tell his parents what had happened, and to feel safe again. He didn't know that this incident would soon become the talk of the town, or that his father's position would make it impossible to sweep under the rug. He just knew that something wrong had happened, and that thanks to the witnesses around him, the truth would come out. Michael burst through his front door, his breathing heavy and uneven. The familiar smell of his mom's lasagna that he'd been looking forward to all day now made his stomach turn. His mother, Linda, was in the kitchen when she heard him come in. The sound of his rapid footsteps and heavy breathing made her pause from where she was pulling garlic bread from the oven. "Michael?" she called out, setting down the baking tray. When he didn't answer, she quickly wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the hallway. The sight that greeted her made her heart stop. Her son standing there, glasses slightly bent, backpack torn, and trembling like a leaf in the wind. "Baby, what happened?" Linda rushed to him, her nurse's instincts kicking in as she checked him for injuries. Michael tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Now that he was home, in the safety of his mother's presence, all the courage he'd shown earlier crumbled. Tears started flowing down his cheeks. It was Mr. Patterson, he managed between sobs. The man from the big house on Maple Avenue. Linda's face darkened as she guided her son to the living room couch her arm protectively around his shoulders. As Michael told her what happened, Linda's expression shifted from concern to anger to determination. When he mentioned the jogger who recorded everything and the neighbors who witnessed it, she nodded silently, already reaching for her phone. "I'm calling your father," she said firmly. Michael watched as she dialed, her free hand still holding his. His father, William Taylor, was well known in their city as one of the most respected federal judges. He usually worked late, but Linda knew he would want to hear about this immediately. "Will," she said when he answered, her voice steady but tight with emotion. "You need to come home now. Something's happened with Michael." She listened for a moment. "No, he's physically okay, but there was an incident. Mr. Patterson from Maple Avenue attacked him." While his mother talked to his father, Michael's phone buzzed with messages. The video was already spreading through the neighborhood group chat. Mrs. Chen had sent a kind message asking if he was okay. Mr. Rodriguez's daughter sent a text saying her dad was ready to be a witness if needed. Then the doorbell rang. It was Officer Thompson and her partner. They'd followed up after responding to the 911 calls. Linda invited them in, keeping one hand on Michael's shoulder as they sat down to take his statement. "You're being very brave," Officer Thompson said gently as Michael recounted what happened. She'd known the Taylor family for years. Their kids went to the same school. But now she was here in an official capacity, her notepad out as she documented everything carefully. The front door opened again, and William Taylor rushed in, still in his judge's suit but with his tie loosened. The moment he saw Michael, his usual composed demeanor cracked slightly. He hugged his son tightly, then sat next to him, listening as Officer Thompson explained what they knew so far. "The video has been secured as evidence," she was saying. "We've also taken statements from several witnesses, including Mrs. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez. The jogger who recorded everything has provided us with her contact information." William nodded, his jaw set firmly. "I want you to know," he said to Officer Thompson, "that I'll be recusing myself from any legal proceedings related to this case. But I expect—" He paused, looking at his son. "I expect the law to be followed to the letter." Linda had disappeared into the kitchen and returned with a glass of water for Michael. The lasagna was forgotten now, still sitting in the oven. The family huddled together on the couch, their dinner plans disrupted but their bond stronger than ever. As the officers left, promising to keep them updated, William looked at his son with pride. "You handled yourself well today," he said softly. "But you shouldn't have had to." Michael leaned against his father's shoulder, exhausted but feeling safer now. None of them knew yet that this was just the beginning. By morning, the incident would be the talk of the town, and Mr. Patterson would learn exactly what it meant to attack a child, any child, in broad daylight. But for now, they were just a family, holding each other close, dealing with something no family should have to face. By the next morning, the Pine Ridge Police Station was buzzing with activity. Officer Thompson sat at her desk, surrounded by witness statements and surveillance footage from nearby houses. The case that might have once been treated as a simple neighborhood dispute had taken on a whole new urgency. Not because of who Michael's father was, but because the evidence was overwhelming. The young jogger's video had been downloaded and secured as evidence. Her name was Amy, a local college student who taught youth running classes at the community center. "I couldn't just run past," she told the officers during her official statement. "Something felt wrong, and I'm glad I trusted my instincts." Down the street from where the incident happened, old Mr. Wilson had come forward with footage from his security cameras. He'd installed them after his garden gnomes kept disappearing, but now they'd captured something far more serious. The crystal-clear video showed the entire confrontation from a different angle, leaving no doubt about what had occurred. "I've had trouble with Patterson before," Mr. Wilson admitted, adjusting his hearing aid as he spoke to the detective. "Last summer, he threatened to sue me because my oak tree's leaves were falling in his yard. Been here 40 years, and I've never met anyone so angry at the world. More neighbors began coming forward throughout the day. Mrs. Chen brought in a folder of dated photographs showing previous incidents where Mr. Patterson had confronted people near his property. Mr. Rodriguez provided a written statement about what he'd witnessed, his grocery receipt attached to prove the exact time and date he'd been there. In his office across town, William Taylor was doing exactly what he promised, recusing himself from any involvement in the case. He called his colleague, Judge Anderson, to formally request that any legal proceedings be assigned to another judge. The law must be applied fairly, he explained, without any appearance of personal influence. Meanwhile, at the real estate office where Mr. Patterson worked, things were getting complicated. His secretary watched nervously as he stormed in, looking disheveled and angry. The local news hadn't picked up the story yet, but the video was spreading through social media like wildfire. "Sir," she said cautiously, "the Board of Realtors called. They've scheduled an emergency meeting about your license." Patterson slammed his office door without responding. Inside, his phone was filling up with messages from his lawyer, all marked urgent. Back at the police station, Officer Thompson was interviewing the crossing guard who worked near the library. "Now that you mention it," the crossing guard said, tapping his chin thoughtfully, "I've seen Mr. Patterson yell at kids before. Always thought he was just having bad days, but looking back, the investigation was thorough, not because of any special treatment, but because the evidence demanded it. Security footage from 3 different houses, 8 witness statements, photos and videos from social media, previous incidents documented by neighbors. It all painted a clear picture of a man whose anger had finally crossed a line." In the afternoon, Detective Roberts knocked on the Taylor's door. Linda invited him in, offering him coffee while Michael sat with his parents in the living room. The detective had brought photos of different angles of the incident, carefully collected from security cameras and witnesses. "You don't have to look at these if you don't want to," he told Michael gently. But Michael shook his head. "I want to help," he said quietly. His parents exchanged proud glances as their son calmly identified himself in each photo, describing what was happening at each moment. As Detective Roberts left the Taylor home, his case file was thick with evidence. This wasn't just about a judge's son anymore. It was about every kid who'd ever walked down that street feeling scared, every neighbor who'd witnessed Patterson's outbursts but felt powerless to stop them, and about a community finally saying enough was enough. The wheels of justice were turning, slow but sure. Mr. Patterson would soon learn that in this case, his money and connections wouldn't help him escape the consequences of his actions. Because this time, the truth was too clear to ignore, captured frame by frame in high definition, and supported by a community that had finally found its voice. By the end of the week, Pine Ridge neighborhood had transformed. The usually quiet suburban streets were filled with concerned residents gathering in small groups, talking in hushed but determined voices. The incident had cracked open something that had been simmering beneath the surface for years. At the local coffee shop, Mrs. Chen sat with her morning tea, surrounded by other longtime residents. "I should have spoken up sooner," she said, stirring her cup absently. "Last spring, I saw him screaming at those kids selling Girl Scout cookies. They were just little girls, couldn't have been more than 10 years old." Mr. Wilson nodded from across the table. "We all saw things over the years, but it's like we were all waiting for someone else to do something about it." The group fell silent, each person lost in their own memories of times they'd looked the other way. Outside Mr. Patterson's real estate office, a small group of people had gathered. They weren't angry protesters with signs, just concerned citizens standing quietly, making their presence known. Among them was Amy, the jogger who'd recorded the incident. She'd taken a day off from her college classes to be there. "It's not just about what happened to Michael," she explained to a local reporter who'd finally picked up the story. "It's about making sure nothing like this happens to any other kid in our community." The reporter nodded, jotting down notes about the growing community response. Inside the real estate office, things were falling apart. 3 agents had already requested transfers to other branches. The secretary had called in sick 3 days in a row. The phone kept ringing with canceled appointments and concerned clients. At the local diner, Mr. Rodriguez sat with his daughter and several other parents from the neighborhood. They were planning a community safety initiative. "We need more than just security cameras," he said, spreading out a map of the neighborhood on the table. "We need to look out for each other, really look out for each other." The school principal had called an emergency parent-teacher meeting. The gymnasium was packed as parents shared their concerns and experiences. Michael's mother, Linda, stood up to speak, her voice steady and clear. "My son was lucky," she said, looking around the room. "He had witnesses, videos, and a support system. But what about the kids who don't? What about the times when nobody's watching? That's what we need to change." Her words struck a chord. Parents began sharing stories of their own children feeling uncomfortable walking certain routes home. Teachers talked about students who seemed anxious about passing particular houses. The meeting that was supposed to last an hour went on for 3. Back at home, Michael was surprised to find cards and letters in their mailbox. Kids from school, neighbors he'd never spoken to, even the elderly couple down the street, they all wanted to show their support. One letter particularly touched him, from a quiet boy in his math class who wrote about his own experience with Mr. Patterson last year. Local businesses began putting up small signs in their windows. "This is a safe space for all children." The initiative had started with a bookstore near the library and spread quickly through the business district. Even the ice cream shop where Mr. Patterson used to get his weekly sundae put one up. The community center organized a workshop about standing up to bullying, not just for kids, but for adults too. "Being a bystander is a choice," the workshop leader explained to the packed room. "And it's a choice we don't have to make." As evening fell, families in Pine Ridge started a new tradition. They took walks together after dinner, greeting neighbors they'd never spoken to before, sharing phone numbers, and creating group chats. The sidewalk in front of Mr. Patterson's house, once a place kids hurried past, became just another stretch of pavement. Linda watched from their front porch as Michael played basketball with some friends in their driveway. A month ago, these kids had been just faces he passed in the school hallway. Now they were regular visitors, drawn together by their shared determination to change things. The incident had shaken their community, but like a stone thrown into still water, the ripples were creating unexpected patterns of connection and change. What Mr. Patterson had meant for harm had somehow awakened something stronger. A community's long-dormant sense of responsibility to its youngest members. The law office where Mr. Patterson sat was nothing like his own plush real estate office. The furniture was practical rather than impressive, and his lawyer's face showed none of the usual friendly reassurance he was used to seeing from people he paid. "They're offering a plea deal," his lawyer said, sliding a document across the desk. "And frankly, Richard, you should take it." Mr. Patterson's face reddened, a familiar sign of his rising anger, but his lawyer held up a hand to stop his outburst. "The evidence is overwhelming," the lawyer continued, ticking off points on his fingers. "We have multiple videos from different angles, 8 witness statements, a documented history of similar incidents, and," he paused meaningfully, "your own words were caught clearly on camera." Mr. Patterson shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "But I'm a respected businessman," he protested, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. "I've got connections. I know people owe." "Not this time," his lawyer cut him off. "Your connections are all running for cover. The real estate board is already reviewing your license. 3 of your biggest clients have publicly cut ties with your agency. And nobody," he emphasized, "nobody wants to be seen defending what you did." The reality of his situation was finally starting to sink in. Mr. Patterson stared at his reflection in his lawyer's window. His usual crisp appearance had deteriorated over the past week. His expensive suit looked rumpled, and dark circles had formed under his eyes. "What about the judge?" he asked quietly. "Everyone knows it's his kid. He must be pulling strings behind the scenes." His lawyer shook his head, almost pitying his client's desperation. Judge Taylor recused himself immediately. "He hasn't made a single call or request. He doesn't need to. The evidence speaks for itself. And honestly, that makes it worse for you. Because now no one can claim this is about special treatment." Outside the law office, life was changing rapidly for Mr. Patterson. His neighbors had started avoiding eye contact. His usual table at the country club was suddenly always reserved. Even his dry cleaner had started claiming they were too busy to take his suits. Back in his empty house that evening, Mr. Patterson found a letter from the Homeowners Association. They were reviewing complaints about his pattern of aggressive behavior. His phone buzzed with another message from his sister in Florida. She'd seen the video and was begging him to get anger management help. He walked to his kitchen window, the one overlooking his perfectly maintained lawn. A group of kids rode past on their bikes, laughing and chatting. Before, he would have watched them suspiciously, ready to yell if they strayed too close to his property. Now, he just felt tired. His lawyer's words kept echoing in his head. The plea deal includes mandatory counseling. At first, he'd been offended by the suggestion. But now, alone in his big house, watching life go on without him, something began to crack in his carefully constructed wall of self-justification. He thought about the look in Michael's eyes when he grabbed him, not just fear, but a kind of sad understanding that made him feel ashamed now. He remembered how his own father used to get so angry over small things, how he promised himself he'd never be that way. The phone rang again. His lawyer, probably wondering why he hadn't signed a plea deal yet. Mr. Patterson let it go to voicemail. Instead, he walked to his home office and opened his laptop. The cursor blinked as he typed, "Anger management counselors near me." In the quiet of his house, surrounded by all the expensive things he bought to prove his success, Mr. Patterson finally faced a truth he'd been running from. Money couldn't fix this problem. His connections couldn't smooth it over. For the first time in his adult life, he would have to actually change. The sun set over Pine Ridge neighborhood, casting long shadows across Mr. Patterson's precious lawn. Tomorrow, he would call his lawyer and sign the plea deal. Tomorrow, he would take the first step toward becoming someone different. But tonight, he sat alone in his darkening house, finally understanding that the biggest prison he'd built was the one in his own mind. The courthouse stood tall and imposing on a crisp morning as people filed into the main courtroom. Mr. Patterson had rejected the plea deal at the last minute, convinced he could still somehow talk his way out of this situation. Now, sitting at the defendant's table in his best suit, he was beginning to realize his mistake. The prosecutor, Ms. Bennett, stood before the jury with quiet confidence. She didn't need theatrical gestures or dramatic speeches. She'd had something much more powerful. The truth, documented in high-definition video from multiple angles. "What you're about to see," she told the jury, "isn't just about one incident. It's about a pattern of behavior that finally went too far." The large screen at the front of the courtroom came to life, showing the now familiar footage from that afternoon. In the gallery, Amy, the jogger who'd recorded the original video, sat straight-backed as her footage played. She'd taken time off from her college classes again to be here. Next to her sat Mrs. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez, ready to testify about what they'd witnessed. Mr. Patterson's lawyer tried his best with a bad day defense. "My client was under tremendous stress," he explained to the increasingly skeptical jury. "The real estate market was down, his blood pressure was up, and—" "Objection, Your Honor," Ms. Bennett interrupted. "The defendant's stress level doesn't justify assaulting a child." The judge, a stern-faced woman with reading glasses perched on her nose, nodded in agreement. One by one, the witnesses took the stand. Mrs. Chen described not just the incident, but years of watching Mr. Patterson's aggressive behavior escalate. Mr. Rodriguez recounted how he'd rushed to help, fearing what might happen next. The crossing guard from the library shared stories of other confrontations he'd witnessed. But the most powerful testimony came from Michael himself. He sat in the witness box, looking smaller than usual, but speaking with remarkable clarity. "I wasn't on his lawn," he explained simply. "I was just walking home from the library, like I always do." Mr. Patterson's face grew redder with each testimony. He'd expected character witnesses to speak up for him, fellow businessmen, country club members, real estate colleagues, but none had shown up. His lawyer had explained, with awkward pauses, that they all had prior commitments. During the cross-examination, Mr. Patterson's lawyer tried to suggest that Michael might have provoked the incident somehow. The prosecutor's objection came fast, but not as fast as the disapproving murmurs from the gallery. Even the court reporter seemed to frown as she typed. The security footage from Mr. Wilson's house played next, showing the incident from a different angle. Mr. Patterson watched himself on screen, seeing his actions through others' eyes for the first time. His shoulders slumped a little more with each passing minute. By the time Ms. Bennett presented the evidence of previous incidents, the Girl Scouts scared away from his door, the elderly man he'd threatened over falling leaves, the delivery driver he'd screamed at for turning around in his driveway. Even Mr. Patterson's lawyer looked defeated. "This isn't about a bad day," Ms. Bennett told the jury in her closing argument. "This isn't about stress or blood pressure or the real estate market. This is about a grown man who chose to attack a child in broad daylight, and who needs to face the consequences of that choice." The jury filed out for deliberation. In the hallway during the break, Michael sat with his parents, homework spread across his lap. He wasn't letting the trial disrupt his studies. Nearby, Amy chatted quietly with Mrs. Chen about starting a neighborhood watch program. Mr. Patterson sat alone at his table, his lawyer busy reviewing papers. Through the courthouse windows, he could see life going on as usual in the town where he'd once felt so important. A group of kids walked past, backpacks bouncing, probably heading to the library. He watched them go, finally understanding that his power and money couldn't protect him from the truth playing out in crystal-clear video on the courtroom screen. The bailiff announced the jury's return. As everyone filed back into the courtroom, Mr. Patterson straightened his tie one last time, preparing to face what he'd spent his whole life trying to buy his way out of: accountability. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the old ceiling fan creaking overhead. The jury forewoman stood, holding a piece of paper that would change lives forever. Her voice was clear and steady as she read the verdict. "On the charge of assault on a minor with hate crime enhancements, we find the defendant guilty." Mr. Patterson's face went pale. His lawyer placed a steadying hand on his arm, but he barely seemed to notice. In the gallery, there was no cheering or celebration, just a collective exhale, as if the whole community had been holding its breath. Judge Anderson, who had presided over the case with unwavering fairness, looked directly at Mr. Patterson. "Before I announce your sentence, would you like to address the court?" Mr. Patterson stood slowly, his expensive suit now hanging loosely on his frame after weeks of stress. For a moment, he seemed about to launch into one of his familiar angry outbursts. But then his eyes met Michael's across the courtroom, and something changed in his expression. His voice cracked. He cleared his throat and started again. "I've spent my whole life thinking I was better than everyone else because of what I owned, what I'd achieved. It took seeing myself on that video, seeing what I'd become, to understand how wrong I was." He paused, struggling with words that weren't practiced or polished. "I'm sorry. Not just to Michael, but to everyone I've hurt with my anger over the years." Judge Anderson nodded, then delivered the sentence. 18 months in jail, mandatory anger management and racial sensitivity training, significant fines, and 5 years of probation. Additionally, Mr. Patterson's real estate license would be suspended pending review by the state board. As the bailiff led Mr. Patterson away, his sister watched from the back row, tears in her eyes. She'd been the only family member to show up for the verdict. Maybe now, she whispered to no one in particular, he'll finally get the help he needs. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered around Ms. Bennett, the prosecutor. This verdict sends a clear message, she stated firmly. Status and wealth don't put anyone above the law. Every child deserves to feel safe in their own community. Michael stood with his parents under a big oak tree, away from the media attention. His father, Judge Taylor, had attended the trial as a parent, sitting quietly in support of his son. Now he hugged Michael close. I'm proud of you, he said softly, not just for standing up to him, but for how you handled everything after. Linda, Michael's mom, was already on her phone, coordinating with other parents. The case had sparked a movement in their community. The local council had approved funding for new youth programs, and several neighborhoods were organizing safety workshops. Amy, the jogger whose video had started it all, stopped by to say goodbye before heading back to college. You know what the best part is? She told Michael with a smile. Now when I run through the neighborhood, I see kids playing outside again. They're not afraid anymore. Mrs. Chen and Mr. Rodriguez were discussing plans for a community celebration. Not to celebrate Mr. Patterson's downfall, but to mark a new beginning for their neighborhood. The local ice cream shop had offered to host, promising free sundaes for all the kids. As they walked to their car, Michael noticed a small group of children playing on the courthouse lawn. They were running and laughing, their backpacks piled under a tree, completely carefree. A year ago, he would have hurried past Mr. Patterson's house, trying to be invisible. Now, watching these kids play freely, he understood that something important had changed. Mom, he said suddenly, can we stop by the library on the way home? I have an idea for a project. Maybe we could start a program where older kids walk with younger ones, so nobody has to feel scared. Linda smiled, sharing a proud look with her husband. The verdict hadn't just brought justice, it had inspired hope. As they drove away from the courthouse, the setting sun painted the sky in bright colors, as if nature itself was celebrating the beginning of something new in Pine Ridge. 6 months later, Pine Ridge neighborhood had transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. The old for sale sign in front of Mr. Patterson's house had been replaced by a community garden, bursting with vegetables and flowers. His sister had sold the property to the neighborhood association at a discount, wanting to help heal a community her brother had hurt. Michael, now in 8th grade, stood in front of the library steps, surrounded by a group of younger students. The Safe Steps program he'd suggested had grown beyond anyone's expectations. Older kids would meet younger ones at designated spots, walking them safely to and from school, the library, and the community center. Remember, he told his group of walkers, it's not just about being safe. It's about being there for each other. The kids nodded, their bright yellow safety vests matching the autumn leaves falling around them. What had started as a simple idea had spread to 3 other neighborhoods in town. Inside the jail, Mr. Patterson sat in his counseling session, looking different than the angry man who'd once terrorized the neighborhood. The expensive suits were gone, replaced by standard issue clothes, but the real change was in his eyes. They were clearer now, more present. I used to think power meant making people afraid of you, he told his counselor. Watching those kids walk past my house every day, seeing how they'd hurry and look down. I thought that meant I was important. He paused, shaking his head. Now I understand that real power is what that boy showed, the power to stand up for what's right. Back in the neighborhood, Mrs. Chen's front yard had become an unofficial gathering spot for the community. She'd set up a little free library next to her flower garden, and kids would often stop there to swap books and stories. Today, she was teaching a group of interested neighbors how to make dumplings, her kitchen filled with laughter and the smell of good food. Mr. Rodriguez had been elected to the city council, running on a platform of community safety and youth programs. His first proposal: extending the Safe Steps program citywide with training and support for teen volunteers. What happened in our neighborhood showed us that change is possible, he told the council. But it takes all of us working together. Linda, Michael's mom, had started a support group for families affected by hate incidents. They met in the community center every Tuesday, sharing stories and strategies, turning pain into purpose. The group had become a model for other communities facing similar challenges. At the local middle school, Amy, the jogger who'd recorded the incident, now volunteered twice a week, teaching kids about digital citizenship and the importance of standing up for others. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is just take out your phone and record, she told them. But the most important thing is to use that power responsibly. Judge Taylor had become a sought-after speaker at legal conferences, sharing how communities could address bias and harassment through both legal channels and grassroots efforts. He always began his talks by crediting the real heroes, the ordinary citizens who decided to take a stand. One sunny afternoon, Michael walked past the community garden that had replaced Mr. Patterson's perfectly manicured lawn. A group of kids was helping Mrs. Chen plant fall flowers, their hands dirty and their faces happy. The fear that had once hung over the stretch of sidewalk was gone, replaced by something stronger: hope. "Hey, Michael," called out one of the younger kids. "Want to help us plant these sunflowers?" He smiled and joined them, kneeling in the dirt that had once been forbidden territory. As they worked together, a new family moved in across the street, and within minutes, several neighbors had gathered to welcome them. The incident that had shaken their community had also awakened it. Mr. Patterson's anger had sparked not just a legal response, but a revolution of kindness. The neighborhood had discovered that the opposite of hate wasn't just the absence of fear. It was the presence of connection, understanding, and active compassion. As the sun set over Pine Ridge, casting long shadows across the community garden, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the streets. The wheels of justice had turned, but more importantly, the hearts of a community had opened. They had learned that true safety wasn't built with fences and fear, but with bridges of understanding and the courage to care for one another.